is one of two lectures this week in which we're covering the digestive system. The other one covers the endocrine system and is very important for the homeostasis lab next week. So please make sure you take a look at that, maybe even before you watch this one, just so that you're prepared for lab next week. This lab kind of ties together with the lab that you already covered about energy and nutrition. So keeping in mind from previous weeks, you should be thinking about the chemical level of organization. Remember that energy is stored in bonds, and when we consume food, we are indirectly consuming energy because the nutrients in our food eventually get cycled into metabolic processes that give us the ATP that's very crucial for our cells to be powered. We also get structural components from our food. So the main macromolecules, those carbohydrates, fats, proteins. We also refer to them as organic molecules or biological molecules or polymers. Those are all found in food and they have different relative amounts of energy storage in them. We'll talk about some other micronutrients as well. And in the fetal pig lab, you talked about structures of the digestive system, so we'll talk about their structure and function today. And again, next week, you'll be talking about homeostasis, so kind of consuming stuff that eventually becomes energy and is carefully regulated, ties into that process. So I'll start out actually by talking about section 3, which has to do with digestive system processes, because it's not just digestion, there's a lot of other stuff happening. So I want you to be able to distinguish between ingestion, digestion, and absorption, and also have an idea of how something called chemical digestion is accomplished, which we'll expand on in the next section that we'll cover, which is section 1. So talking about components of the digestive system and specifically focusing on the human digestive system. The textbook goes into other body plans, but since this is human biology and a lot of you are going into health professions, I want you to be prepared for that. We're going to be thinking about structures that accomplish digestion as well as accessory organs. So you should be thinking about where food actually travels. For example, I might ask you if you would expect to find food in certain organs, and you have to be able to recognize where you would actually find food. We'll get into section 2, which is on nutrition and energy production, going back to those macromolecules and micronutrients, that chemical organization of life, including this idea of essential nutrients. We'll revisit ATP, and I'll briefly go over basal metabolic rate one more time. You talked about that in lab already. And then we'll finish with section 4, which is on digestive system regulation, thinking about how the nervous system, which we'll cover next week, and the endocrine system, which we covered this week, also control and manage digestion. So when we consume our food, we get building blocks that are really important for our cells, for who we are, and for the different processes happening in our cells. So we get what are called macro and micronutrient for our body structures and function. So those include things like carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids like DNA and RNA, and fats. And remember, fats are very important, even when we're thinking about eating them. They're important for different forms of metabolism. They're important for our nervous system. They're crucial for supporting our internal organs. So fats play a lot of really important roles in our body. They're also a huge structural component of our cells. They're part of our cell membrane. So I just want you to keep that in mind when we're talking about food. Also, micronutrients are very important. These are things like vitamins and minerals that maybe don't make up these huge, bigger molecules like macromolecules, but are still very important for all of the chemical processes happening in our cells. They fit together with enzymes and they do a lot of really important things. So when we're talking about digestion, we're really thinking about taking something big and breaking it up into pieces. So on the right, there's this diagram. We have a polymer, which is a large molecule, getting digested into many small molecules. And then we get to take those monomers, those small molecules, and put them back together into a bigger structure. So what this is representing is that process of digestion For example, if you eat an egg, you break it down into smaller pieces, you absorb those pieces into your body from your digestive system, and you put them back together in different ways, kind of like Legos. So you're not going to use the components of those proteins the same way that the chicken might. For example, you're going to make different proteins out of those amino acids that you broke apart. So digestion is just this breaking apart process. If you ever work in a research lab, you might do a restriction enzyme digest, which is when you take a special enzyme and cut apart pieces of DNA. So digestion is really just breaking stuff apart. We still have to get the stuff into our body, and we still have to absorb it into our cells once it has been broken apart. So we use what we absorb to make proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, everything that's really making up who we are. So like I mentioned, there are processes that are related to digestion but are not actually digestion. So there's ingestion first, where food gets into our mouths. It gets into that open cavity. And here I say open cavity because in other body plans, like for example this sea anemone, there's only one opening for food coming in and waste coming out. So that's just a different body plan. So we say ingestion through an open cavity. Then we have proper digestion, which can be broken down into mechanical and chemical digestion. So taking that food, breaking it into smaller particles, and then into smaller molecules. So actually cutting apart bonds. And then once it's able to be absorbed into our cells, we go through this process of absorption. That's a picture of this small intestine, which will be crucial for this. That's when soluble material can actually cross through the plasma membrane and get into our blood and lymph. So the digestive system is working with a lot of other systems to accomplish these processes. It's not just working on its own. All right, so to kind of expand on these a little bit, ingestion is when we have entry of the food into the mouth or the oral buccal cavity. There's a lot of technical terms for it. And at this point, we have some chemical and mechanical digestion actually occurring. We'll expand on that in just a moment. Once food is kind of processed in our mouth and swallowed through a process called propulsion and then starts to travel down into our esophagus, we call that a bolus. And as it's traveling down into the stomach, it's doing that through these smooth muscle contractions called peristalsis. We then have digestion, which can be mechanical or chemical, like I mentioned. For humans, it tends to be through the form of chewing. So primarily we have mechanical breakdown happening through chewing with our teeth. I'll explain what a gizzard is in just a moment. We do have some mechanical breakdown happening in the stomach as those muscles are churning, and then also a little bit in the small intestine through what's called segmentation, where the food that's been processed in the stomach gets separated out into little pockets. But basically the goal of this is to increase surface area. So I'm sure a lot of us have had that experience where you get like crushed ice and it makes your water super cold, which is like very useful in Fresno in the summertime, right? So having that crushed ice increases the surface area for the ice to interact with the water, which makes it really nice and cold much faster. When you have bigger pieces of ice, then there's less surface area relative to the volume, and you don't have as much room for interaction and exchange of heat energy. So when you have more surface area after chewing your food, that increases the ability for the chemicals to act on it. It's kind of like the difference between chewing your food and being a snake and like eating a whole deer, and then the deer just sits in your stomach for a week or so because it takes that long to break down if you don't chew your food. So I mentioned gizzards. So birds have gizzards, and birds also don't have teeth. You might have heard of gizzards before, like in the form of chicken gizzards. Sometimes they're eaten, but birds don't have teeth. So when they like eat worms and peck their food off the ground and seeds and stuff like that, they can't chew it up. And so what they do is as they're pecking, they also swallow stones. And so these little stones get caught in an organ called a gizzard. And the gizzard traps food that's being pushed down their digestive system, and they use the stones to grind them up through mechanical digestion, which is just amazing to me. Like, I'm terrified of birds. They're really weird to me, but this is like a super cool bird fact. So after we have a decent amount of mechanical breakdown, we have chemical breakdown. And actually this starts at the same time as mechanical breakdown in our mouths. So you might have had an experience where you eat a piece of bread and it starts to taste sweet as you're chewing it in your mouth. It turns out the smaller the carbohydrate, the sweeter it tastes to us. So when you chew that food, when you chew that bread, you have amylase from your saliva, which is breaking apart starch in the bread. And so it's making it into smaller and smaller carbohydrates, smaller sugars, and it's starting to taste sweet. So we have some chemical breakdown in our mouths, we have a lot of it in our stomachs, and actually even more in our small intestines. So in the stomachs, it goes from being a bolus to being chyme. And then that chyme gets released into our small intestines for even more chemical breakdown. So this is an enzymatic process. You're actually using different enzymes to break apart particular molecules. So there's unique enzymes for each type of macromolecule. And there's a lot of them for proteins because there's so many different types of proteins. So when you do this, you're breaking those bonds apart into smaller pieces, so then you're able to actually absorb those molecules into our cells. So this is done using a process called enzymatic hydrolysis often, where we have an enzyme that's facilitating the hydrolysis of bigger molecules. So what this is showing here is a disaccharide. Saccharide means sugar, di means two. So on the left side, we have a double sugar. That's something like lactose or sucrose, kind of bigger sugars. And these are too big to move across our plasma membrane and get absorbed into our cells. So we use water and we break that molecule apart. So hydro means using water. Lysis means to split something. So the water gets split, that molecule also gets split, and the two pieces of the water seal off the two new molecules. So you have two small monosaccharides, single sugars, that are able to cross the plasma membrane and make it into our cells. And I mentioned that there's unique enzymes for each of the different macromolecules. So something like an amylase might be used to break apart bigger carbohydrates. We also have individual enzymes for particular disaccharides. So for example, lactose, which is sugar found in milk, gets broken down into glucose and galactose using the enzyme lactase. There's a class of enzymes called proteases, which are used to break apart proteins into amino acids. Nucleases break down nucleic acids into nucleotides, and lipases break down lipids into fatty acids and monoglycerides. There's also a lot of acid involved in this process, as well as water, like we mentioned, and salt, so lots of different chemicals involved in chemical breakdown. So once you're able to actually absorb stuff into your cells, we go through this process called absorption. So soluble material is crossing the plasma membrane, and for us that's happening a lot in our small intestine. So we have tons of surface area in the small intestine. And so that huge amount of surface area really allows us to move stuff out of that lumen, that open space in our small intestine, and reclaim it. Because if we don't absorb it into our body, it just passes out as feces. So once we absorb it, we're able to start circulating it around and processing it. Material gets processed first in the liver and then makes its way into circulation. So it goes to all of our body tissue as it's needed and through careful regulation. So really quick along those lines, I want to look at a case study. You might have heard of celiac disease, and you've probably heard of people avoiding gluten. So gluten is a protein that's found in wheat products, and celiac disease is a really serious reaction to gluten, and it's actually an autoimmune disease where your body attacks itself. So what happens here is that there's an immune response against gluten. Your body starts producing an antibody. Remember, we talked about those, and you can actually test for those. And it targets villi in the small intestine. So it flags those as dangerous, and it starts attacking these structures called villi, which increase the surface area of our small intestine. So then your villi are decreased in surface area, and they're no longer effectively able to absorb nutrients from our digestive tract. So we go from having a normal gut with tons of surface area to a diseased gut with very little surface area. And I'll show you pictures of that on the next slide. So here you can see endoscopic images on the top of healthy gut, and also a microscope slide of a healthy gut. On the bottom, you see when you have celiac disease, it looks much smoother. There's a lot less surface area. And so if you don't have those cells reaching in to absorb and grab those nutrients, you end up with malnutrition, iron deficiency anemia, vitamin deficiencies, specifically A, D, E, and K, because those are fat soluble, so we rely on being able to absorb them individually instead of just dissolved in water. You get calcium, copper, zinc deficiencies, chronic diarrhea because stuff's just passing through your body and not getting absorbed. You're at a higher risk for certain cancers, and as you're going through important growth checkpoints, you might not be growing. If you have celiac disease and you're pregnant, you might have complications because you're not getting enough nutrients. So like I mentioned, anything that kind of passes through our body becomes feces. We don't have all of the enzymes necessary to break down everything we eat. For example, fibrous material from plants, we don't have an enzyme called cellulase, so we can't break apart their cell walls. So that material is important for kind of just getting stuff to move through our body. Fiber is important. It's also soluble fibers associated with heart health. So we sometimes just don't need to absorb stuff. It's not a perfect machine, so stuff just passes through our body. And so elimination is that passage of undigested material or feces out of the digestive system, and it's very different from excretion. So when we talk about excretion, we are specifically talking about getting rid of nitrogenous waste from the kidneys. And I talked about that at the end of the endocrine lecture. So please make sure you're familiar with excretion and that you're keeping that separate in your mind from defecation. A lot of people use the word excretion to refer to feces, and they are very different. So to summarize, we have ingestion, digestion, absorption, and defecation, and there's a lot of differentiation about where those happen in our body. And like I mentioned, this is a very complex process. So even though we have distinct systems, there's a lot of overlap. The cardiovascular system is involved in circulating material after we absorb it. The endocrine system is really important for regulating different organs of the digestive system. A lot of your lymphatic and immune system is actually located on your intestines. So we have what's called gut-associated lymphoid tissue. Your body learns a lot about kind of bacteria from your intestines, and the lymph system is also important for lipid transport after you absorb it. The nervous and muscular systems are involved in regulation and contraction. The skin and urinary systems are involved in vitamin D and calcium regulation, specifically the kidneys. So there's a lot of stuff that's interacting with our digestive system and helping to accomplish those tasks. Also, my dog is snoring, so I'm really sorry if you can hear this. She keeps getting anxious that I'm coming into the room by myself, and so she wants to hang out, and so I apologize for any snoring. She's very cute and very needy. Okay, so when I showed you the anemone, I mentioned that there's kind of different body plans for digestion. So there's some organisms, like sea anemones, that have the same opening and exit. That means that they can't ingest more food until they've kind of gotten rid of what's inside of their gastrovascular cavity. So if you ever decide to be awful to anemones and you go tide pooling, you can throw sand into them, and then they'll eventually kind of just spit it all out, and they'll spit out everything that they were digesting too. So that's not very effective because you don't have the opportunity to fully capture all the nutrients from your food before you have a startle response or before you take in more food. We can absolutely have breakfast and have it still be digesting in our bodies and eat lunch and then keep digesting and eat dinner. And we're able to really maximize our ability to break down fully and absorb the nutrients from our food before we have to get rid of it as feces. So we have what's called an alimentary canal, which is basically a big hollow tube that runs from our mouth to our anus. And if we look here at this small intestine, and if we were to kind of snip it and stare down it like a hose, we would see something that looks like this. So we'd see kind of the epithelial tissue around the outside, that connective tissue. We'd see a lot of these finger-like projections sticking in. So there's circular folds and villi, and all of the individual cells lining those villi have their own microvilli. And then there's this big opening in the center. So that lumen represents a hollow tube that runs throughout your whole body through that digestive system. What that means is that the inside of your digestive system is technically not a part of your body. It's technically separate. So that's why when we have exocrine glands that empty into the digestive system, they're still considered exocrine because they're leaving your body. So material doesn't count as in your body until it crosses the plasma membrane of the cells lining the digestive system. So like I mentioned, an alimentary canal allows for you to really fully digest your food and take care of all those other processes like absorption. We see these in humans, mammals, birds, reptiles. So there's an alimentary canal in a lot of kind of vertebrates and organisms like that. So when we're looking at specific structures of that alimentary canal, we might be thinking about like the mouth, esophagus, stomach, the intestines. We'll walk our way through each of those. But there's also what we call accessory structures or accessory organs. Those provide support for the digestive system without actually transporting the food. So for example, food doesn't go into your liver. It doesn't go into your salivary glands, but the liver and the salivary glands are crucial for digestion. So we call those accessory structures. So on a quiz or on the final, I might ask you in which of these structures would you actually expect to find food. So you would need to recognize what's an alimentary canal versus what is an accessory structure. So when we're talking about the upper alimentary canal, we're talking about the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus. The mouth also has the tongue, salivary glands, and teeth working with it, which again are not technically part of the canal, but are supporting structures. The pharynx just refers to the throat, so I'm not going to have a separate slide for that. All right, so the mouth is where mechanical and chemical digestion begin. It's where we also have ingestion taking place first. The teeth and the tongue are very important for getting food mechanically digested. Your tongue helps move stuff around and get it towards your teeth. It's also important for positioning that bolus in front of your throat before you swallow it. The salivary glands produce saliva, which is mostly water, but which also has ions, glycoproteins, growth factors, different waste products, and immune components, as well as enzymes like amylase, which we talked about earlier. So again, we have ingestion and mechanical and chemical digestion all happening in our mouth. Again, the pharynx is the throat, so that's just involved with the muscle, kind of muscly component of swallowing, and then we get into the esophagus. This esophagus is pretty much just a tube that goes from your pharynx to your stomach. It's a muscular tube, so it's able to go through that smooth muscle contraction of peristalsis. There's some skeletal muscle up at the top near your throat, but it transitions pretty quickly into smooth muscle. And remember, we don't have voluntary control of smooth muscle. So that is just, smooth muscle contractions. You can't go to the gym and work your esophagus. It's just going to do what it's going to do. So you swallow, it enters the upper esophageal sphincter, which is a circular set of muscles to kind of open and close and control flow through different parts of the alimentary canal. And then it goes through the lower esophageal sphincter to get into the stomach. And that lower esophageal sphincter is very important clinically. If you have kind of inflammation and problems keeping it closed, then you have what's called reflux. And if you have consistent reflux, it can be very damaging for that tissue, and you might have what's called gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. A lot of babies struggle with reflux. My daughter has it, and so you just prescribe Zantac, which kind of helps control the acid production in the stomach. So moving into the lower alimentary canal, you have the stomach and the small and large intestines, as well as the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, which are not actually part of the alimentary canal, but are very important accessory organs that we'll talk about as affiliated with the lower alimentary canal. So the stomach is very, very flexible. You've probably seen people who do that competitive eating and eat like tons of huge containers of lettuce to train. And that's because your stomach can stretch from about the size of your fist to about 4 liters in volume. So you can have tons of food and fluid, and it's constantly turning and moving around. It has really unique muscle, so it accomplishes tons of mechanical and chemical digestion. It does a very tiny amount of absorption, and it also makes something called intrinsic factor, which is important for absorbing certain vitamins. And then it slowly lets material into the small intestine. So it also has a very unique sphincter that's important for controlling the flow of material from the stomach to the small intestine. That's crucial because that material in your stomach is super acidic, and you don't want it just rushing into the small intestine before you can control the pH. So this is what the stomach looks like. It's pretty curved. Hopefully you saw what it looks like on the fetal pig. And so it has an extra muscle layer called the oblique layer. The histology of your alimentary canal is surprisingly consistent throughout, but the stomach does have a unique layer that gives it the ability to churn food and go through that mechanical digestion. And you've probably had the experience of really feeling your stomach churn. So again, that's mechanical and chemical digestion taking place. There's tons of acid in there. There's tons of enzymes that are activated by that low pH and that are thriving. The stomach also has this huge mucosal barrier, and the physical nature of the mucus, as well as the fact that it's very alkaline, it's basic, it has a high pH, means it protects the stomach from eating itself. The stomach also has tons of stem cells, and remember, stem cells are important for mitosis, for regenerating cells, for differentiation. So that all those together stop the stomach from breaking itself down. And so I mentioned that the stomach has this unique sphincter. That pyloric sphincter connects the stomach to the top of the small intestine called the duodenum, and that pyloric sphincter is really important for controlling that chyme that's really acidic leaving the stomach, so that the small intestine has a chance to balance it out and make it more neutral before it continues through the small intestine. Because the small intestine doesn't have those unique mucus barriers or stem cell features, it has different specialization. And it turns out that there's some bacteria that can actually survive in the stomach pretty well. There's a type of bacterium called Helicobacter pylori or H. pylori. You might have heard that in the context of stomach ulcers. So basically it gets to burrow into that mucus lining, and it also produces an enzyme that increases the pH around it. That's really bad because your stomach then thinks that it hasn't made enough acid, and so the H. pylori keeps making pits of your stomach more alkaline. Your stomach produces more and more acid, and you eventually end up with stomach ulcers. Stomach ulcers are kind of associated with stress, but the person who discovered that they were caused by bacterium had a hypothesis about it. And he was like, I really think H. pylori is what's doing it. and he swallowed a culture flask of H. pylori to give himself ulcers and prove that he was right, which is crazy and also kind of genius, but it was really sketchy. That's not how you're supposed to do science, but he did prove that H. pylori is what causes stomach ulcers. Okay, so getting into the small intestine, this is arguably the most important structure in the digestive system. Everything else we can really kind of bypass or figure out a way to get around, but if you don't have your small intestine, you're not going to be able to absorb and get the nutrients from your food. So most chemical digestion and almost all absorption occurs in the small intestine. Like I mentioned, there's a huge amount of surface area, so about 200 meters squared for every 10 feet of intestine. So that's about 100 times the surface area of your skin. We often think about skin as being kind of the biggest organ, but your small intestine has way more surface area than your skin. So when we're looking at that small intestine, there's the duodenum, which is this short kind of component displayed in purple, then the jejunum, which is displayed here in teal, and then the really long ileum, which is displayed here in pink. The duodenum is important because that's where a lot of chemicals from the gallbladder and from the pancreas enter through a ductal system. The jejunum is where a lot of absorption takes place, and the ileum is where you have a lot of the immune system components. It's where the absorption of lipids occurs through structures called lacteoles. So that's important for the absorption of lipids and also lipid-soluble material. So again, it has a huge amount of surface area, and it allows for tons of chemical digestion and absorption. On this bottom right here, we see what are called circular folds, which are kind of those bigger curves in the bottom left of that image. You have the individual villi along those circular folds, and then each cell on those villi have their own microvilli, so you have just a huge amount of surface area. The microvilli are also called the brush border. So when you go on to take physio and anatomy, you might see that term brush border or brush border enzymes. That's what it's referring to. Getting into the large intestine, that starts with the cecum. In herbivores, the cecum is really huge, but with us it's just kind of a tiny bump. So there's some absorption taking place there. There's more lymphoid tissue, a lot of gut bacteria hang out in the cecum, and then we get into the colon. So that's kind of the bulk of the large intestine. That's where you have a lot of water reabsorption. It's where feces gets prepared, and there's also a lot of mucus there. So we have the ascending colon kind of going up, and then it goes across from the right side of your body to the left through the transverse colon, and then down into the descending colon before getting into the sigmoid colon, and then eventually the rectum. So the rectum is where you kind of separate out feces from gas and kind of compact the feces together. Then you have the anal canal, where you have both involuntary and voluntary sphincters to control the flow of feces out of your body. So you might notice if you look at the kind of histological slides of the large intestine, it has a lot less surface area than the small intestine, but there's still some absorption taking place, and there's a lot of mucus production. So that helps with the flow of feces. So I mentioned there's some accessory organs associated with the lower alimentary canal. There's the liver, which produces bile and then exports it to the duodenum. There's the gallbladder, which is important for storing the bile from the liver. You can actually survive without your gallbladder, which we'll get into in just a moment. And then the pancreas, which is where you produce a lot of pancreatic juice, which involves digestive enzymes and bicarbonate, and then that also gets exported to the pancreas or to the duodenum. So again, the liver is where we have bile being produced. We have that material getting moved into the alimentary canal, and you also have a series of veins called the hepatic portal system. You don't need to stress about that for a lecture. When you go on to take physio and anatomy, you'll cover it in more detail then. So the hepatic portal system is just the series of veins that moves material from your small intestines to the liver for detoxification and processing. So the liver is the largest gland in your body. In human adults, it weighs about 3 pounds. It's a very dense tissue, which you might have noticed when you were dissecting the fetal pig. And you probably had to really lift the liver up and move it completely out of the way to be able to look at other components of the digestive system because it's so huge. It consists of a very large right lobe and smaller left lobes. So we can see that pictured here. So affiliated with the liver, we have the gallbladder. Hopefully when you dissected the fetal pig, you were able to take out the liver and look at the back of it and see the gallbladder. It's this tiny green bubble where you basically store extra bile and kind of have it on retainer so it can get released into your digestive system. And so that bile has a lot of alkaline material. It has bile salts and pigments, different phospholipids, electrolytes, cholesterol, and triglycerides. So it's really important for processing lipids and lipid byproducts and really making sure they're emulsified and able to be transported. So for example, if you eat a lot of red meat with fat in it, it will be very important to have your gallbladder. But there's a lot of problems associated with the gallbladder too, and many people end up having theirs removed. My dad had his removed, so he just can't eat a lot of red meat or a lot of fatty foods because it can be very painful if you don't have your gallbladder. The pancreas is really important for producing pancreatic juice, which has a lot of bicarbonate as well as digestive enzymes. So this is very important for control of the pH of chyme moving from the stomach into your small intestine. We also have these cell clusters called acini that secrete pancreatic juice. So here we see that the pancreas is kind of releasing material into ducts that then connect to your alimentary canal. So it's exocrine. But in the endocrine lecture, we saw that the pancreas also has endocrine function. So it produces really important hormones like insulin and glucagon. And so here we see that the pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine function. So remember, a huge reason why we eat food is to break apart polymers in our food, those big macromolecules like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, and get those individual monomers that we need to make structures in our body. So we absorb simple sugars, we break triglycerides actually down even further into monoglycerides and fatty acids. We have amino acids and individual nucleotides, which also actually get broken down even further than that. And we're able to absorb those and kind of move them around in different ways and either use them for metabolism to generate energy, or we use them to build structures. When we're talking about macromolecules, you might hear about people counting their macros. So that's this process of figuring out what proportion of your calories are coming from specific macronutrients. And you kind of did this a little bit in lab as well, in the most recent lab. This is a screenshot from the fitness subreddit, kind of explaining how you might calculate your macros. And the reason you might want to calculate your macros is because it's thought that different proportions of those different macronutrients, specifically carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, might help change your body composition. And if you have certain conditions, like you might want to follow the ketogenic diet for medical recommended purposes only, then you might need to maybe increase the proportion of your calories coming from fats and from proteins to put you into a state of ketoacidosis or ketogenic state. So here's an example of kind of different macro proportions for different kind of fitness goals. So maybe increasing muscle size, maintaining your body composition, or kind of getting rid of fat in your body. And so remember that carbohydrates, for every gram of pure hard carbohydrates, there's 4 calories. Calories are just a representation of energy in your food, so stored in the bonds of your food. There's 9 calories per gram of fat and 4 calories per gram of protein. And let's say that you have a 2,000 calorie diet. If you do the math, 1,200 calories are going to be coming from carbs, 600 from fat, and 200 from protein. And that's how we calculate percent daily value. This is also a good way to reflect that the 2,000 calorie diet and the percent daily value probably isn't perfect for you, and really most likely is not perfect for you. We all have dramatically different body composition. We all have very different physical and mental and emotional needs, and we all kind of have different ways of interacting with food and eating. We all have a very different basal metabolic rate. Remember, that's the energy that your body needs to kind of just survive at a certain metabolic state, at a state of rest, at a comfortable room temperature per day. So we're all different. We all have different basal metabolic rates. We all have different needs. So that 2,000 calorie diet and looking at the percent daily value probably isn't the best way to do things. That's why it's important to kind of know what's in your food and know where those calculations come from in order to make healthy decisions about yourself if you want to. It's totally okay also if you are recovering, or if it's a stressful thing, or if you have work and you can't think about your food. It's okay to just focus on other things. We can only do so much at a time. You do the best with what you have. So in addition to macronutrients, we also get micronutrients from our food. Vitamins are organic, minerals are inorganic, and we need them both kind of in small amounts, which is why they're called micronutrients. Some of these are essential nutrients, meaning that we can't get them on our own. We can't synthesize them in our bodies. We have to get them from our diet. So a lot of these are involved in the chemical reactions that take place in our body. A lot of minerals are stored in our bones, and so these might be important as coenzymes or as part of different biochemical reactions. Another main reason why we eat is to get the ATP, the energy for our food, or for our body, to power our cells. So ATP is basically the currency of our cells. It's able to kind of store energy so that we can use it for different cellular processes. It's produced by this very general thing called cellular respiration, which I'll get to in just a moment. Remember that by breaking apart ATP and popping off a phosphate group, we release energy that's stored in that bond, and so we're able to access that energy and use it to power other reactions. So when we have ATP being produced, that's often through cellular respiration processes. We usually do it through carbohydrate metabolism, so by taking carbohydrates, breaking them down, and then cycling them through these processes. But fats and proteins can also be broken down and cycled through these metabolic pathways as well. So when we talk about cellular respiration, that can be aerobic, meaning that we need oxygen, or anaerobic, meaning that it doesn't require oxygen. And it often involves different series of processes. So it usually involves glycolysis, which is a quick way to get ATP in our cytosol. It might involve the Krebs cycle, which is called TCA, or the citric acid cycle as well. It might involve this electron transport chain, or oxidative phosphorylation, which is how we get a ton of ATP. Or if we don't have oxygen, it can involve fermentation. So for example, lactic acid fermentation happens in your muscles when you are running a lot and you don't get enough oxygen into them. So we mentioned that there's a lot of different systems involved with digestion, and one really important system that regulates digestion is the nervous system. So next week we'll talk about divisions of the nervous system. One division is the autonomic nervous system, or ANS, and that regulates our response to food through 3 different phases of digestion. So the cephalic phase is really neural. That's before we even put food in our body. So when we see food, it starts preparing our mouth and our stomach for that food. The gastric phase happens as food enters the stomach, so it's promoting gastric secretion and motility, so kind of that churning of the stomach through neural and hormonal mechanisms. And then the intestinal phase controls that release of chyme from the stomach into our small intestine. It promotes digestion in the small intestine through neural and hormonal mechanisms. So these are three separate neural physiological phases of digestion and of digestional regulation. There's also hormonal control of digestion. So we have a couple different feedback loops that are in place to maintain stomach acid during digestion. So as food enters your stomach detects protein present. Cells called G cells release a hormone called gastrin. That gastrin stimulates the production of HCl, or hydrochloric acid, from parietal cells lining your stomach, and digestion is able to occur. So then food is turned into chyme, it gets transported into your small intestine, and so now the stomach is empty, which means that somatostatin, another hormone, is released elsewhere in the body. It travels to the stomach, it acts on those parietal cells, and acid production stops. So these are together constitute a negative feedback loop that kind of keep things in homeostasis. That will make sense to you if you watch the endocrine lecture. Please make sure you do that. So other hormones that help regulate digestion are involved in the regulation of pH and chemical digestion in the small intestine. So the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the small intestine are all connected to one another through a series of ducts. So there's the hepatopancreatic duct, the common hepatic duct, the bile duct. So those connect the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas to the small intestine. So chyme enters the small intestine from the stomach. It's very acidic, and remember, your pyloric sphincter controls how much is regulated, or how much is entering your small intestine at a time. Your small intestine doesn't have protection from the acid like your stomach does. So as food travels from your stomach to your small intestine, a hormone called secretin stimulates the pancreas to produce more of that alkaline bicarbonate, which neutralizes stomach acid entering your small intestine. And then another hormone called CCK stimulates the pancreas as well as the gallbladder. So we have many different hormones involved with regulation of digestion. Okay, so please make sure you watch the endocrine lecture before the next lab, review the quiz feedback, check the study guide when it's posted. It will be posted by 5 p.m. on Friday like usual. Email me if you have any questions. Use the study guide to prepare for the next quiz, which will be available Monday through Wednesday, and complete the online reflection.